Good morning and welcome. My name is Casey, and today we're going to talk about the war on drugs. I couldn't have asked for better guests to discuss this matter with. Today we have with us Neil Magnuson of the Cannabis Substitution Project, host of Pot TV and Vancouver-based cannabis activist. Dana Larsen is also with us, founder of the Coca Leaf Cafe, author at Pothead Books, co-founder of the Vancouver Seed Bank, amongst many other notable endeavors. Rob Laurie is an international cannabis and psychedelics lawyer who is doing wonderful work in this field. And last but not least, we have Lloyd here as well. Jack is an editor for Green Candy Press and the book called The Psilocybin Mushroom Bible. He's also a cannabis and psychedelics lawyer based out of Toronto. I'd like to start by asking Dana a question. Given the original intent of the war on drugs to supposedly reduce harm caused by the illegal drug trade, how has it actually impacted society?
Well, I'm not sure that was the real reason to start the war on drugs or the war on drug users. I think it was more about racism and punishing people and controlling people and that kind of stuff. But I mean, it's been about 100 years now, give or take, depending on what date you want to use to start things. And over the last century, we've seen overdose deaths increase every decade. We've seen incarceration increase every decade. We've seen a great deal of harm caused by prohibition and drug war, not just in Canada to drug users, but also around the world in the countries where these things are produced and against the Indigenous people that have used the natural herbal forms of many of these banned drugs for millennia since recorded history. So in my opinion, this war on drug users has been nothing but a source of misery and harm and death and destruction all around the world. And it's time to put that chapter aside. Doesn't mean that drugs themselves don't have some harms potentially associated with their use in some circumstances, but everything in life is like that. And the way to minimize those harms is through legalization and regulation and that kind of thing, and not through criminalization and prohibition and punishment, which really just makes everything worse. So that's where I stand on the war on drugs.
Mm-hmm. It almost seems like they gave the general population like, hey, this is why we're going to do this. It's to everyone's benefit, for everybody's safety. But in reality, like the way that they're dealing with it is actually causing so much more pain. And like, if something exists, who are we to just deny it? Like, if something is just there, who are we to say that it's not a good thing or nobody's allowed to use it? Like,
who are they, right? Who are they? These people that have attempted to prohibit drugs on the premise that they were going to save people from themselves and save society from the scourge of drug abuse. If that was their actual intention, they've gotten like the complete opposite of that, increased drug abuse, increased everything to do with the things that they would be trying to stop. But if their intention was to control uncontrollable substances so that patentable substitutes could be used instead and profits could be made on the war on drugs, then it's been a fantastic success for these people that have filled prisons that make money and managed to protect the interests of pharmaceuticals and other drugs. So yeah, it's been a huge violation of people's rights. The governments on behalf of these corporations that want to control these things have assaulted our rights to such a degree. It's actually about freedom of thought that they're interfering with, your ability to go out and think for yourself or change your mood or whatever. There's no justification whatsoever for prohibiting these plant medicines that makes any sense at all. But it makes huge dollars for these groups, and that's why it continues today in the face of all of the science that says it's wrong.
I'd like to know, like, your thoughts, Rob, on where we're at now with everything, and like, what are the steps to be like not in the midst of a huge drug war and have all of this addiction and issues related to the matter? Like, what are some steps to actually get there? What does that look like to you?
We're so out of balance as a society. I mean, not just our relationship with drugs and prescriptive medications, but the environment and culturally with each other, everything's so out of whack. But our leaders and politicians sort of have this attitude, well, enough that they can call an election in the middle of a pandemic, that, hey, it's all right, there's no real problem. And if there is a problem, we're dealing with it in the name of public health, public safety, and keeping our kids safe, where you can pretty much assign that label to anything. And, government can justify it. So I think really where we're at is we're at a time where there's a recognition of what traditionally has been the story isn't working. And I just wanted to start off also by saying, it's a real honor to be asked to be part of a podcast like this. I mean, 12 years ago, when I was requalifying as a lawyer in Canada, that's what I, was reading about the Malmo Levine cases and Randy Kane, who recently passed away. And of course, the work that Dana Larsen was doing, he sort of about 10 years ago was kind of surpassing Mark Emery in many regards, if you will, as the thinking person's activist in the cannabis space, and the work that he was doing was pushing the boundaries. So that, coupled with Neil and the work that he's done and the adventures that we've been on, and Jack, it's a real honor to be part of a discussion. And I mean, I'm so interested. I'm going to shut up here and hear the others, but no, this is a topic near and dear to my heart, and to be up on a podium today with Jack, Dana, Casey, and Neil is a real honor. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know. It's easy to look at it and say, like, it's not my problem kind of thing. Like, a lot of people would look at this and say, oh, well, I'm not addicted and it's not affecting me, but I think it affects everybody. Whether you're addicted.
Can I add one last point? I mean, I've mentioned a few times in different points when I presented, but I was one of the youngest documented cases of ADHD in North America and was prescribed Ritalin by the age of 4. And so for me, I had a very different view of drugs. Like, to me, Ritalin was a success story. I mean, without Ritalin, I was the Tasmanian devil in school. And to me, there wasn't this issue about stigma. It was like, well, it's legal, there's a prescription, no problem. But you look at something like cannabis against that, and it's incredible. You have, like, again, no one said anything about, oh, Robbie Laurie, a 6-year-old and his brain development. It was like, no, he's calmed down, he's performing well in class, he's a positive, productive member. And there was no issue. There wasn't like being frog marched down to the nurse's office to take Ritalin under supervision. My mom would wrap it in a little tinfoil pouch and include it with my lunch. No, I mean, the teachers knew when I wasn't on Ritalin, and they'd literally ask, Robbie, did you take your pills, right? So very different. And then you jump forward where you're seeing terminally ill medical patients and epileptics requiring this life-changing medicine, and the hurdles and the excuses and so on. And so for me, being able to have understood all of these hurdles and have an import license to import more than a 6-month supply of Ritalin into the UK, I came back and I'm like, these cannabis laws make absolutely no sense. I mean, there's a double standard. And so really, I feel that my role in a lot of this is to call out that double standard and suggest, on the one hand, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater, but we need to rethink these medicines and their role and their licensing, because everyone goes on about, oh, we got to make this legal, but the Food and Drug regs, the Food and Drug Act, and the pharma regime, a lot of the deck is stacked against these medicines being brought into the mainstream. And I think that's what we have to acknowledge and realize, is that these medicines, methods, methodologies, and practices, at least in the case of psychedelics, were totally cool up until the 70s, where for the first time, a government, the Nixon administration, deemed them as antisocial. So, I mean, that is the tide that we have to swim against in order to justify and continue to justify the work that we're doing and the role and the access that these medicines should have. And I mean, Jack and Dana have taken what that means to provide access to new levels. And I'd love to hear what they have to say on this. And Neil. Is everyone mic'd off?
Oh, did
Yeah, Jack, I'd like to hear, what your views on this is, and like, how do you see the next steps kind of in regards to addiction and the war on drugs and stigmatization?
Well, that's a great question, Casey. I will likely respond because I'm a lawyer, so my response typically will be a legal one. But as far as addiction goes, we saw this year some positive steps in that the Public Prosecution Service of Canada made an indication that simple possession of a variety of substances was no longer necessarily in the public interest to prosecute. So there's a de facto decriminalization of simple possession on the books for Crown prosecutors. So the police still lay those charges, and I see them in court on a daily basis, but they're very regularly being withdrawn or stayed by the Crown almost immediately. And I think that in a political sense, at least for justice system participants like myself, there's a clear destigmatization of users of drugs. And I think that is, like these dialogues can so frequently become very negative, just because the war on drugs has been so traumatic for so many people. But I will say that's a distinctly positive policy from the federal government. Now, it remains to be seen what comes of it as far as larger policy changes. But I do think that there's a destigmatization of drug users to that extent. Now, it does not apply in many ways to victims of overdoses. It does not apply in many ways from a community and policing perspective. They're still being arrested and jailed. They're just, when they go to court, the judicial branch of government is saying, get out of here, your charges are stayed. So it's still not where it should be, which is full-scale decriminalization or legalization of these substances. So I describe it frequently that they've taken the smallest of possible steps in the right direction, which is sort of from my perspective, clients charged with simple possession. That is a good thing for them. Now, I will say from a cannabis perspective, because of that decision from the federal government in regards to prosecutorial discretion for the simple possession of drugs, a lot of police are now simply laying provincial charges for possession, which so it's not a criminal charge; it's really a regulatory offense. But the problem is that for marginalized cannabis users, the fines are often impossible to deal with. So it creates its own form of stigma and continues that stigma in negative ways. So we took a very small step in the right direction. I guess that's what I'll say as far as the last 12 months. As far as the future is concerned, I do anticipate legal challenges to be forthcoming as a consequence of the federal government's decision to stop prosecuting simple possession. Because if there's no interest in prosecuting it, then there's a very strong argument. Rob mentioned a case called Malmo Levine. The full name is Malmo Levine, Kane, and Clay, but that dealt with simple possession of, in that instance, cannabis, which has been legalized. But in my view, a lot of the arguments can be run again. Essentially, that was so. I think there. Like it or lump it, there will be litigation coming on behalf of drug users, but the consequences of the war on drugs do continue despite our best efforts. I suppose that's my my response. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense. It's kind of hard to change something overnight too if it's existed for a while. It's not like it's going to be tomorrow that everything is the way it should be. Like you said, there's going to be upheavals and things that might not be so pleasant, but in order to get to a better place, it might be necessary from where we're at the moment, I guess.
Well, the real problem is corruption. The reason that it doesn't end is because there's a whole bunch of people making a lot of money off the status quo. Legalization just meant that the government would take over the sale and production of cannabis, hand it over to insiders and rich people, maintain an artificially high price on cannabis, and people would just pay their fines up front to go and purchase it from them, or suffer the consequences of purchasing outside or selling or producing outside of the system, where they increase the penalties and increase the amount of money going to law enforcement. The stigmatization continues as they treat cannabis as if it's somehow way worse than alcohol, just based on the regulations around it. There's no desire from all these groups that are making money to stop making money. And with legalization in Canada, all the groups that are making money off of prohibition still get to make money off of prohibition. This is not legalization. This is just the government trying to a takeover of the industry. It's brilliant, really, on their part. A disruption of activism, with a number of our people in the community going over and working for the legal regime, thinking they can make change from within, but still disrupting activism. The general public thinks it's legal, not realizing that they're just paying hefty fines up front to go and buy from the government stores. And so, yeah, this was brilliant on their part, and we need to make sure that we get to be able to provide low barrier access to people, that poor people, sick people, people suffering from addiction, they need to be able to get cannabis easily, cheaply, really good cannabis, because sick people have to have really good cannabis. People getting off opioids have to have really good cannabis. And there's no reason they can't have it except for government interference. And that's the new push that's what the old push was. That's just the new name for the push we've always had, is let's have easy access to cannabis, storefronts we can walk into and buy it just like any other commodity, and priced reasonably based on what it takes to bring to market, not what the market will bear and what government interference can create.
Mm-hmm. What really gets me is how long a lot of these plants have been existing, and like how long we've been interacting with them, not just over the last 100 years or so, like thousands of years. So we need to respect what they are, and not put a facade on it and demonize it and disregard it.
Especially with cannabis, we have the endocannabinoid systems that's common amongst all the vertebrates on the planet, that goes back millennia and indicates that we've had a relationship with cannabinoids for millions of years here. Dana knows more about that than anybody.
Yeah, do you have anything to add to that, Dana?
Sorry, what do I know more than anybody? I turned just away just for 1 second.
Basically, cannabis and cannabinoids and humans' interaction with the weed.
Oh yeah, I'm not sure I know more than anybody, but I've written about cannabis in Canada and the history here, and I've researched a lot about the history around the world. But yeah, all of these plants, from cannabis to coca leaf, opium poppies, psilocybin mushrooms, and other kinds of mushrooms, peyote cacti, all of these things have been used by human beings since before recorded history in most cases. As for medicinal and social and spiritual purposes. And, when we talk about the war on drugs, in some ways it goes back hundreds of years. I mean, we had prohibition of coca leaves and coca chewing among the indigenous population by the colonial Spanish, until they realized they could make money off it and instead monopolize coca cultivation and coca trade to capitalize on it. And there was the opium wars in China, where China made the great mistake of trying to prohibit the opium being brought in by the British, instead of trying to legalize and regulate and create a legal opium industry, which would have probably been a lot more beneficial to them. And so these are things that really have been going on in some ways for hundreds of years, these kind of drug wars and conflicts, because these plant medicines are incredibly useful and beneficial, and in most cases quite cheap to produce. So if you can get in between people and the access to these plants, there's a lot of money to be made. People are willing to pay quite a bit for these things that you can ultimately grow and produce very cheaply, just because they're so incredibly useful. And in many ways, that's, nature's or God's gift to humans is access to these plants that provide such incredible medicinal, social, spiritual benefits that cost almost nothing to produce, and can have such incredibly positive results for people. And so I think a lot of this drug war, as Neil's pointing out, is about profiteering. It's about controlling people. It's about trying to get in between people and these substances so you can make profit off it. And what I think is unique about the war on drugs when it comes to social human rights issues and things around the world is that this is one where both sides of the conflict really profit and benefit from the war on drugs. Drug users don't benefit, but drug dealers and drug cartels and things make tons of money. They love prohibition as much as the cops do because it's incredibly profitable, and prohibition keeps their competitors out, keeps their prices high, and maintains their monopoly. And maybe sometimes someone has to get sacrificed to the jail system, but for the vast majority of people, especially those in the upper echelons of the drug trade, they rarely, if ever, really feel the consequences of their actions. And if they do, and they're murdered or imprisoned, it just creates an opening where many others see an opportunity to move in and increase their profits. And in many ways, when you take out somebody, like El Chapo or Pablo Escobar or whatever, you take someone like that out, we go, oh, great, we got a bad guy. But the reality is it creates more conflict. It creates more violence. It creates more challenges because people struggle to replace that person and fill that gap and take over. And we see that in the local level here as well. When they raid a gang or bust some gang members, they're like, oh, we got these bad guys off the streets. Well, that's sort of true, but that doesn't really solve the problem. In fact, it makes everything worse because now you've got a conflict over replacing that person, and gangs and groups will be fighting and shooting at each other. And so we perpetuate and increase the conflict, and we increase the violence. I'd prefer to have a legally regulated and controlled system with reasonable prices and positive access, but really just letting the drug dealers continue to do what they do and not interfere, there would be an equilibrium established, right? Where there would be less violence and less conflict, and quality of the substances would increase simply because of the natural forms of competition available. And so what we do not only causes harm to drug users, but also has all these peripheral effects of gang violence and creating gangs. Gangs, as we understand them, probably wouldn't really exist without prohibition and drug war. Maybe they'd be involved in some other things, but the vast majority of what we call gang violence and gang activity and cartels, it's all drug trade related. It's all about tapping into the incredible profits created by prohibition and drug war. And so it's unlike a lot of other issues, in terms of like gay rights and that, there wasn't anybody really profiting off of the other side of it. And so I think in some ways it's easier to bring those things forward, but there's so much money involved with the drug trade, and that it's incredibly profitable. And that just really makes it challenging to end it when so many people benefit in so many ways. The losers is everybody else, all the rest of society. If you're not a cop and you're not a drug dealer or a cartel or something, then the drug war is just terrible for you. Even if you don't use drugs, you're not involved in it, it makes your community less safe. It creates more violence. It creates more conflict. You're paying a lot of taxes that are going towards this. And so there's those who benefit, and those who benefit are often in people in positions of power. And then there's the vast majority of people that just suffer or deal with the negative consequences of this. And it goes all the way down. When a cop seizes, we talk about not charging drug users. Well, that's great. But when an officer stops somebody and takes their personal drugs away from them, now what does that person have to do? They're going to go buy some more. So their dealer likes that because now they've made a double sale. Somebody bought something, paid for it, it got taken away. Now they got to go buy some more. So the drug dealer thinks this is great. The cops are helping him make more sales. But that person, especially if they really need that substance to deal with withdrawal symptoms or to deal with pain or a medical condition, if they've got a timer going as to when they need their next dose before they start to really suffer, and they're only looking for $5 or $20 or whatever it is just to get their next batch, they're going to go break into a car. They're going to do prostitution that they maybe don't want to do. They're going to do petty theft or whatever they have to do to get that money as quickly as possible and solve that. So that actually creates crime and creates criminals, people who don't really want to do that. Their desire was not, they weren't thinking, I'm going to go break into a car today. But now they got to face a real challenge. Am I going to commit this crime, or am I going to suffer through some immense pain? And all of us, we would commit the crime. If given that same choice and that same circumstances, we would all do the exact same thing and make that exact same very rational choice of trying to stop yourself from suffering and being in pain by doing something maybe you don't want to do. So what we call the war on drugs creates so much conflict, so much terrible things. And I really think when we end this multi-generational challenge some point in decades and decades away from now, we're going to look back on this as one of the worst mistakes, and with the same kind of shame and challenges that we look back on slavery or other terrible multi-generational things. And in some ways, the war on drugs is an extension of slavery and the racism and Jim Crow and all that stuff. It's all kind of interconnected historically as well. But these are important issues, that this is profitable for so many people who benefit off of this. And that's one of the reasons why it's so hard and so difficult to get rational drug policies in place.
Just for a second and say that what it is it's cutting right at the very heart of the essence of life itself and what it's all about here. Life itself is two basic things. It's the pursuit of pleasure, or it's the avoidance of pain. And that's what motivates all of our decisions. And that's where all of these laws are cutting right into the very heart of our rights to be able to do that, by saying that you can't deal with your pain with these natural substances. You're going to be forced into these ones. It's nobody's right. They're way out of their realm of what should be right and wrong in this world. And now the lawyers should comment on that.
If I can jump in on the point, like I'm working with clients that are doing things in New Mexico and working with government, and the cartel's the biggest problem because they recognize and acknowledge that they're going to have to involve them in some form in this. So it just means that if you include these businesses into this international opportunity, then it means, well, they're not doing something else. And really, yeah, it's a larger issue. And I think when a lot of people look at legalities, they don't appreciate that there's an international law element to this, which a lot of the agenda was brought by the United States leading that agenda. And so the reality, I think, now is there's got to be more and more political pressure, the right kind of pressure, to enable the United States to lead internationally to try to undo a lot of these laws, which go back, as Dana rightly put it, to opium, coca, and cannabis prohibition in like going back to the 20s. But here's the other thing. You've got the international system, and China and Russia are both have life appointment and veto power at the Security Council of the UN. I see that being a very clear and present limitation to the recreational legalization of a lot of these products at the international level, because I can't see how Russia and China are going to want to have any type of a legal access form for psychedelic, psychotropic, and psychoactive plant medicines, because they're already dealing with those issues in their black market. So all that being said, that's where the work of activists like Dana and Neil, I think, again, they push these boundaries and borders beyond anything that governments, at least right now, can really tackle. So really what it does is, I think the beauty of it is it creates these great paradigms where you're able to demonstrate, hey, this is how we've been doing it. People have been benefiting, people are safe, people are happy, people are healthy, versus these very complicated, drawn out methods of legalization, which in cannabis, right, I think they're realizing they're going to have to go back to the drawing board. And then recently there's been some interesting news how groups like the Canadian Psychedelic Association have worked with other groups to effectively hand up proposed legislation to the federal government, to the health minister, based on the ACMPR. And I mean, I've had nothing to do with that. I think it's an interesting proposal, but my theory, or my suspicion of why this is being pushed so hard is that there's a number of publicly traded companies that are in this space at the moment. And everyone is saying wrongly that psychedelics are the new cannabis. And what they forget is that it was like a 20-year litany of litigation that got us to this point with cannabis, and with psychedelic or with psilocybin, it's still early. So these companies are pushing, like your Field Trips, Numinous, I'm sure there's a number of others. But for them, they want to see the government adopting something sooner or later. Why? Because then they can sell something sooner or later. And to them, that's a big deal, because it means their share price will do something and everyone will make money. So to me, I think it's interesting, because at least with cannabis, it was a group of insiders that brought this legislation working with the Liberal government. Now it seems to be activists and members of the community that are, again, trying to bring regulation. But is it the right kind of regulation?
Years to come here to sort this thing out. I don't know how it got to be this way. It is completely upside down. It makes no sense. How it ever became a crime when there was no mens rea, no actus rea, there was no intent to cause any damage, there was no victim. And yet here we have, after decades of evidence of the actual unintended consequences of the war on drugs and what that's meant in the ruination of lives, the lies that have been told, all the corruption that's involved here. The government has known, I know they have, for decades, that there's no justification for prohibiting cannabis especially, but any plant medicine there's no justification in interfering with people's access to plants. So they've known the damage that's being caused by doing it. They've known it's wrong. So they've got actus rea, they've got mens rea going on there. A ton of damage has been done by this war on us as free people and our access to plants. So why can't we have these people charged, arrested? Why doesn't our court system deal with just how wrong this actually is? And I think that's got to be worked out by you guys, the lawyers, because I don't know how to do it.
Yeah, it's like we have prescription medication. Is there like any way that we can eventually have prescriptions for people with cancer, like to have what they need to heal? Because right now it's quite expensive. And especially if someone didn't have a source, and since it's not really regulated, maybe it's not clean, and maybe there's other substances in there that might kill them. Shouldn't there be like
there's been trillions and trillions of doses of cannabis that have been consumed by people over the last decades, and there's been no trouble with any of it. There might be some people that have compromised immune systems to the point where cannabis is harmful to them. I don't know those people. I know a lot of people with compromised immune systems who use cannabis and it really helps them, but there might be that. People need to be able to go and get cannabis easily in a grocery store, just like you would tomatoes and carrots. It grows just like a plant. There should be branches of cannabis buds there. Take them home and trim them. It's $5 or $10 a pound, because that's all it takes to bring it to market. And if people have medical issues and they're concerned about what was maybe that was grown in then there needs to be stores for those people to go get cannabis that they know has been tested and is clean, and they'll look after that. And we've been self-regulating this industry for 20 plus years really, really well. And the sick people, they take care about how the cannabis is that they're using, and other people, they just use cannabis of all different strains, all different types, all different kinds, because there's never really any problems. Even if maybe it wasn't flushed properly once, you just don't smoke that strain again. But there's no serious problems with any of this. There's no need for all this crazy regulations and keeping the price up by lying. It's absolute corruption. These people should be arrested. The truth is obvious for now for anybody who wants to look at it. I hope it gets sorted out in the courts, because they're the only ones that seem to have the power to say yes or no on you must or you must not. So, we've applied to Health Canada over 11 months ago now. 11 months ago on the 16th, coming right up. Emergency application, help us save lives on the downtown east side. We've been proving it for years. If you don't help us, we're limited in how much we can help people. And yet they sit on it. They don't do anything about it, because I know that they're not allowed to say yes to us. They've made promises. Health Canada, the government of Canada, has made promises to very, very rich people that they will not allow the sale of cannabis below the price that they're setting for it to make these people trillions of dollars. And that's why they won't say yes to us. It's only economics. Not because there's anybody potentially going to be harmed by us giving out high-dose edibles or selling high-dose edibles or good quality cannabis and all of its concentrates. Not of that at all. That's not what Health Canada is concerned about. That's not what they're working on every day on our file to see if they can give us approval for what we're doing. Their only concern is the economic damage that will be done to these government stores and licensed stores if they allow low barrier access to storefronts in communities across Canada. It's a shame. It's a real, real shame.
What do you think about that, Rob? Just curious.
Well, you have administrative branches or the executive and legislative branches of government, and they can, well, only do what they can within those powers. And I guess the difficulty is what Neil's calling for is to demonstrate, that people are negligent and so on. And I mean, that's quite difficult. Because within the branch of administrative law, I mean, the simplistic rule is the government's allowed to cock it up, for lack of a better analogy. It just has to be within a reasonable threshold of a mistake. You see, if they take into account irrelevant considerations, and that's the difficulty, or bias, or in these other traditional grounds of which you can set aside administrative decisions for being outside of their jurisdiction or their vires. The problem is government, again, are allowed to make the mistake if they truly are demonstrating that they are acting in the best interests. And I mean, that's why anytime Trudeau opens his trap about cannabis, it has to do with making streets safer, streets and children safer, communities safer, protecting our kids, and taking money out of organized crime. I mean, the end of the day, they succeeded in that? Perhaps a little bit, but they haven't done anything for groups that are accessing cannabis, such as what Neil's doing, and they're making things a little bit more difficult for Ted Smith than perhaps they need to be. But at the end of the day, you've got insurance, which we haven't really touched upon. And you have politicians that their greatest issue, of course, is they got to get reelected. And I think the difficulty in all of this is, look, cannabis and plant medicines is dear and close to the hearts of everyone participating on this call. But when you look at our local politicians, and I mean, I've gotten to work with a lot of them, and a number of them have been a great assistance to these endeavors. But cannabis and psychedelics, compared to larger issues and campaign matters, is just the reality that we're at. And I think the issue is that we all have a place whereby we can demonstrate to government, because we've borne witness, that in fact, that there are better ways to regulate these medicines, and that providing those alternatives and strategies to government is part of the step. And I think that advice has definitely been used against me a few times by groups that, have decided, hey, we're going to come up with something and give it to government. And hey, if government has nothing else to consider, then they'll go with that. And so this is, again, I think it's an opportunity for all groups to step up. But law is a complicated beast. I mean, what might make sense in one fact pattern, of course, as Jack will be able to attest, may be totally applied the other way by the judge. I mean, this is where I think, we're at a time where, despite all this AI, I mean, decisions still have to be made by humans interfacing with other humans. And I mean, it's the realization of these costs, the costs of the drug war, costs on public health. I mean, and those are figures that public health and government do look at. I mean, it started with that initiative with cannabis dispensaries in Vancouver. And I mean, the early work of CAMCD was instrumental in the city of Vancouver's decision to license dispensaries. I mean, right, wrong, or indifferent, right? I mean, and that's the difficulty. You see with law, you get issues being championed by activists in the courts. You have private member lobbyists going to government through those methods. And then you get government being given delegated authority either by the courts or by legislation conferred by parliament. And it ends up almost being a political will. And that was very evident with cannabis, a political will to legislate cannabis in a vein very different from that litany of litigation, as John Conroy calls it. And so I think that's very much what's going to happen with psychedelics. Groups like Dana will push the tempo. They'll provide access. Lobbyists will say, we got to regulate this, got to stay ahead of it. And what eventually will be passed down will be something that will work, but for a small minority. And you end up with what we have with cannabis, which is a tale of two cities. And while legalized, regulated markets may be very difficult, well, that's led to burgeoning alternative markets. And again, thank God for the alternative market, because ironically, the black market is the only thing keeping the legal market totally honest, quite frankly. So, my 2 cents. Let's hear from Jack. He's kind of on his workout, it looks like.
Oh, I'm so sorry. No, it's been kind of a long day. I'm on a deadline, and my leg, I've been sitting. So I'm just in my backyard. And so I was just walking back and forth. I was cramping up. I apologize. I realized that might be distracting for everyone, but I was quite uncomfortable sitting. So
I thought you were moving. I thought you were going to a meeting or something.
No, I'm literally just pacing back and forth in my little garden. Sorry,
well, Jack, you're more involved with the psilocybin efforts, with what's happening with interfacing with the government. And are you able to talk a little bit about that and sort of where things stand with the courts? And because I agree with you, I think that it's inevitable there's going to be more charter challenges one way or another.
Well, that's a really good question. I think that the real, if we were to look at this from a broad governmental perspective, I think the real question we should be asking ourselves is strategically, why did the government start granting Section 56 exemptions, and why is the government granting dealers licenses to, so Section 56 exemptions being granted to terminally ill individuals seeking to utilize psilocybin to see if it provides them with therapeutic benefit, and as well licensed dealer licenses being provided to a host of publicly traded companies. And so atmospherically, it does look like something is afoot. And if you ask me as a litigator, what I think is the government is desperately trying to avoid litigation brought by someone who requires access to psilocybin and cannot get it, and then gets charged seeking access to it, or producing it for themselves, or possessing it, similar to Terry Parker. Because if a ruling similar to Parker were to flow from a court, it would result in a situation that looks more similar to cannabis. And so, Rob, you talked about the litany of litigation in regards to cannabis. Really what that is about was the fact that those repeated cases forced the government into a position where they legalized cannabis. Like, the government was dragged kicking and screaming into legal cannabis. And I think that the issuance of these exemptions and licensures for businesses is a sign that the government doesn't want it to go that way this time with other substances. And so that's good, in that people won't have to be charged criminally, but it's also bad in that it may well arbitrarily restrict access to psilocybin in the event that they begin licensing only very restricted forms of synthetic psilocybin, whether they begin authorizing people to access psilocybin only through 2 or 3 companies that have access to the product. So I think that in some ways, the government is trying to avoid litigation. I don't know if they're going to be successful at it. And really, I think that if they do sort of start introducing an access channel for people, I'm very hopeful that it's a satisfactory access channel for affected parties, because otherwise, from a litigation perspective, it's very hard to win. If they create a really, really crappy system, then it becomes very difficult to win more legal challenges.
Because courts have to give the deference to the legislator.
Yes, but they also have to look at whether or not restrictions on liberty, which is what we're talking about, are arbitrary. And as long as the government can tie their restriction on liberty, so as long as the government can say, well, look, go get your psilocybin from Pfizer. Pfizer is the psilocybin place. Quit complaining to us about where you get your psilocybin. It's very, we will win. Like, there's great arguments to be made, but it's infinitely harder than if the government is simply saying, no, you can't have any psilocybin, right? Because there's significant amounts of evidence that support psilocybin access and support medical patients' liberty interest in accessing it. But so I'm not sure if that makes sense, but you see what I'm saying is that we might not want to win a legislative amendment. Like, government is very rarely your friend. You're much more, from a patient's perspective, you're much happier to win a court case in which a judge says, look, you cannot arbitrarily restrict access to psilocybin. And if you do so, and you don't have a program in which people can access it legally, then we consider that to be a very serious violation of Section 7 of the Charter. You get a ruling like that, and it's upheld at a court of appeal, then you've got a system in which patients are protected. Patients can access psilocybin in a sensible way. That's the situation for cannabis. That's why the government doesn't like what Neil is doing. The government says Neil isn't allowed to describe what medical cannabis is. We describe what medical cannabis is. And our description is not arbitrary. We promise. And Neil says, well, look, I have a significant number of very sick people that are trying to access this medicine, and they can't do it through the mail. They can't grow it for themselves, and they can't find someone to grow it for them. And even if they could, they couldn't afford it. So we're providing it as low barrier access. And the federal government's position has always been, well, look, that doesn't count. That's not medical cannabis. We describe what medical cannabis is. And the core of it is that if they go after Neil has a valid argument pursuant to the most recent cases called Howell from Alberta that dealt with a young girl with Odahara syndrome, that someone was producing cannabis oil for her, and she passed away just recently. It's very, very sad. But ultimately, the law was found to still violate the charter, right? And so the existence of that milieu of jurisprudence is what protects medical cannabis patients, right? So, like, I'm always very wary if we start saying, like, oh, maybe the government will legislate something that will help sick people. No, they won't. It's not in your interest to have them dictate it. Like, I would much rather have a judge tell them that it's a charter protected interest under Section 7 for someone to have access to life-saving medicine than to have some used car salesman that got elected to Parliament tell me what a sick person is allowed to do. So that's my 2 cents on it. Sorry to go long on that.
No, I think that's wonderful to hear a perspective from somebody who actually practices in that kind of, like, that's your forte, that's what you're doing, and you see a lot of the up close and personal rules and how they affect things and how the rules actually get made. So yeah, I guess it's not in the public's best interest to have a legislation made by the government to help people get their medicine.
Legalization is not what we were fighting for, Dana.
Well, the words can mean different things to different people, right? You say decriminalize, and to one person that means well, you leave people alone. But decriminalize can also mean giving people a fine or a ticket or sending them to drug court or things like that. And, legalize can mean, well, it's legal, so it's easy to access. I can grow it. I can buy it in the store. But legalization, as we see, can also mean a whole lot of very complicated and restrictive rules and harsh punishments that can sometimes be harsher than they were under prohibition for certain things. And so, the language, so we maybe talk about liberation or something like that, but the language can always be twisted around, in terms of what we're seeking and what we're looking for. But to me, the important characteristics of a good legal system are that people can buy or use these things in a cheap and accessible way. And as Neil was pointing out, legalization of cannabis or mushrooms or really any of these things should mean that they're cheap and plentiful and easy to access in a high quality manner. That really is kind of, if it's not like that, then it's not really legal, and it's not really liberated, and it's still being controlled and restricted overly. We need a system where the punishments are not like way out of whack compared to anything else. It need to be, the punishment for selling unregulated cannabis should be similar to the punishment for selling unregulated oranges, and that kind of system. So that's my perspective on that the language we use is careful. And Jack really makes a lot of good points when it comes to, we all kind of agree war on drugs is bad, marijuana, other things should be legalized or decriminalized or liberalized or whatever, but how to make that happen and what the actual practical steps are can often be very frustrating, because you realize, this is going to take decades more to get to where we want to get. But that's the reality. This is a multi-generational conflict, and it's going to persist beyond us in many ways, even post-legalization, like we see with cannabis. There's still decades of work to be done to really have a proper system in place. And when we look at like heroin and psychedelics and things like that, it's going to be a very long, slow process as well.
The legalization of recreational non-medical cannabis has completely thrown poor people and sick and suffering people right under the bus. It's been an absolute nightmare for them. And we wouldn't have a chance if that was all it was, because nobody cares enough about those people. But because there's a public health crisis with respect to the overdosing of poisoned drug supply and other tainted drugs and just street drugs in general, there is a hope that because cannabis is effective, especially in the form of high-dose edibles, to get people through withdrawal, that big barrier to getting off of drugs, and then substitute the use of those dangerous drugs. Because there is that going on, we do have some ability to try to force the government into allowing low barrier access to poor people, and people try that. I mean, we'd be in trouble for a long time. I think we have a chance here of forcing the government to allow for low barrier access. But I'm agreeing with what I'm hearing here. It's probably going to be in the form of a charter challenge that goes through the courts, and then hopefully gets the courts to say that, well, people have a charter right to access easily. And so we'll see.
Well, really, with tactics, it's like people like me and Neil breaking the law and doing civil disobedience that gets us to where we want to get. And then having the lawyers there to back us up in court and defend it when things go bad, and to represent the patients and others harmed by this. But that, to me, is the magic combination. I'm not sure. I guess lobbying and things like that maybe are helpful, but really, to me, it's breaking the law, creating the reality that you want to be, and being lucky enough to live in a country like Canada that has a charter of rights that really allows us to make these things happen. A lot of this is really ultimately thanks to Pierre Trudeau passing the charter when he did. That has allowed so many positive things to happen and allowed the courts to really make changes to the laws that otherwise wouldn't be there. If you can convince a judge that this is a right that is being invalidated by the charter, that makes wonderful positive things happen.
And I loved what Neil said about freedom of thought, because I think that's
next.
I think it's a crucial component of issues around psilocybin. Like, it grows in the wild, right? It's very difficult to say that something that's been growing here since the dawn of time is illegal for someone to possess. But I think at its core, there is actually a very serious potential violation, and I look forward to litigating this issue should someone be charged with psilocybin, that prohibiting access to, consumption, possession of, or trafficking of psilocybin, in a sense, is a completely unjustifiable infringement on not only Section 7 of the Charter, as far as our liberty interests are concerned, but Section 2 of the Charter, which generally deals with expression and association, but also thought, which typically has been related to religious freedoms. But I think in many ways it's deeply connected to freedom of thought, and that there's really very little jurisprudence on that issue, and it's difficult even just to express what it means unless you've sort of experienced psychedelics oneself. But I loved what you said there, Neil, and I'm very much on the same side there. I think that any test case involving psilocybin needs to be not only pursued under Section 7 of the Charter, but also under Section 2 of the Charter. I've been thinking about that for actually about a year on that.
Do you know
topic.
where I think that'll come? I've been working a lot with First Nations groups, for 8 years on cannabis, and the last 3 was different psilocybin and psilocin related projects. And that's the beauty. I mean, cannabis was brought to British Columbia effectively by draft dodgers in the 70s. Well, psilocybin and psilocin species mushrooms, you can find them all over the Pacific Northwest, up and down the coast. And this is where, again, you talk to different indigenous groups that say, well, we want to get into cannabis. And you explain to them, or at least I try to imbibe that cannabis, if you take a step back from the whole thing and look at it from a point of view of regulated food, then that opens up a whole lot of other avenues. And the interesting thing is that, really that's what that comes down to, is that Quanah Parker and the peyote religions that came out of that, I mean, from what Michael Stewart Ani has been sharing and teaching me, is that was effectively a reaction by the Lakota, Sioux Lakota, which recognized that all of their rights and way of life was going to be completely eviscerated, and that the only way to actually preserve some of that identity was to cloak what they were doing into a religion based off of a Catholic dogma, so they could demonstrate that structure and theory and basis of religion when they went before eventually the US Supreme Court. And so why I think that's interesting is that in many ways, First Nations and Indigenous groups, if they're able to, figure these ideas out on their own land with band and council deciding to exercise inherent or their sovereign jurisdiction, for example, plus they're able to show oral traditions and a historical connection and use of these medicines prior to contact with Europeans and maintenance of those traditions to present day, then you see, unlike cannabis, I think, at least when I look at through the lens of a BC First Nations, this could very much be the way that holds a lot of these practices and traditions in balance. Because I've been very lucky, anytime that I've been able to engage in a psychedelic experience, it's usually been with a traditional practitioner, and there has been an Indigenous, traditional, cultural, ceremonial aspect. And to me, I think a lot of the beauty of that is eroded when you try to transfer that into a purely clinical setting. And so for me, where I remain optimistic is that I think, Indigenous groups, especially in light of the residential schools and resources and strategies available to them to deal with PTSD and recovery of trauma and intergenerational trauma, I think the barriers of access for those people to these medicines will be a very interesting scenario. because if they can show the connection of the substance on their land, the social, ceremonial, and cultural, it's at the very least, and the government in working with those groups should be able to arrive at a form of regulation, which I assure you will be very different from the type that, say, a group like Theracil or Field Trip or so on and so forth. So for me, this is why I think it's a multi-battle war, and everybody has a role and a part to play. And so when Neil, when you said, are you still an activist? Well, yeah, I definitely am. I've just, again, moved a little bit more of the work that I do into other circles and other areas, and I've been working with government and groups behind the scenes. So, in a time like this, I think it's the less people know, the better. You're muted, bud.
I don't know if you heard that. I like what you said there about the use of these substances with respect to PTSD and the Indigenous communities because of their experiences with the Canadian or the European governments, but also because it helps to deal with alcoholism. And that right there should be a no-brainer, that they get to have these things and use them as they will if it's going to help them with their alcoholism, which was imposed upon them by the Europeans. So just another angle.
But it's interesting. I mean, out of the downtown east side, there's a line from Charles Dickens in I believe, what was it? David Copperfield. They describe the industrialized London as from this sewer, pure gold flows. And that's been a way how I've looked at the downtown east side. I mean, it's such an ugly place in some regards, but it's often in places which really there's nothing left to lose in some regards, where the greatest change can happen. And I mean, you look at how dispensaries were embraced when the government handed around that first set of regs. It was like they were designed to prevent dispensaries from operating in areas where they were traditionally needed. So I think that government has a role, of course, to play in this, but how do we get to these answers? It's a multi-headed hydra and battle, and it's going to take coordination between various groups, I think, and we're seeing more of that. And in fact, I remain optimistic that the future will bring something. But I think it's safe to say, and Jack did highlight this, that we're going to see only like EU GMP grade, lab produced, synthesized psilocybin. I mean, that's what I thought was going to be coming out a year ago when I was working with Jack and the team and the Theracil Alliance, because I was like, how are you just going to allow patients to somehow access substances from an unlicensed, illegal, unregulated market? I thought what they would have had at the time as a temporary measure, like a group like SciGen, who has licenses, or other licensed groups, would be making amounts available, given that we're not at a 30,000 patient number system like we were, or, with medical cannabis. So again, I think what we're going to see first will be synthesized drugs that resemble more of a DIN number than a natural identifying number. And that's really where I think, there's going to be challenges, because they don't want, they want a nice, easy, repeatable solution. What they don't want is what Neil and Dana are involved in. But what Neil and Dana are involved in is kind of ironically what moves the boundaries and the goalposts and gets groups looking at it and saying, well, no, if you're going to legalize someone, legalize us, not them. But, so it can go any number of directions, but cannabis and what we've all experienced from the drug war battles there is, I think there's going to be more of the same with psilocybin. I mean, it would be fanciful and foolhardy to think that, well, all of a sudden the government's going to figure it out. I mean, look how they're doing with COVID. So.
Yeah, well, I feel like this is something that we could probably all talk about for quite a few hours. But, I think we have to do today. And I really appreciate everyone taking time out of their day to talk about this. I think it's really awesome. And I'm grateful for all the work that you're all doing. So, yeah.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to have this platform, have some chats with these gentlemen, in the forefront of getting things done here. And certainly things need to get done yet because our world is still upside down and corrupt, and we've got a lot of work to do yet. And I think we got some good people involved in it. So, thank you for bringing us together and for having me on for sure, and with these guys.
You all inspire me. Everyone here is doing good work and an amazing job, and really happy to participate. So thank you.
Thank you for having me, and it's good to see everybody here again.
Yeah, it's been too long.
Lovely to speak with and work with you all. Thanks for putting this on, Casey, and what a pleasure to work and learn with everyone today.
And everybody overgrow the government, right?
Well, we've all got facial hair now since the last time, the three of us, at least, Casey excluded. We've all got some pretty decent facial hair, and Neil's got the Magnum PI going. I like it.
Well, I'm not sure decent by whose standards? In my case, anyway.
Cheers, everybody. Have a great day.